practice room on the third floor of the Moscow Conservatory had witnessed countless hours of musical struggle over its century-long existence. But what was happening on this particular March afternoon in 2019 seemed to defy all reasonable expectations. A small figure sat at the grand piano, feet dangling several inches above the pedals, hands that seemed impossibly tiny stretched across keys that had challenged some of the world's greatest pianists. The child wore a simple blue sweater and jeans, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and an expression of fierce concentration that belonged on someone decades older. This was Anya Volkov, 7 years and 4 months old, attempting to learn a piece that music professors had declared fundamentally unplayable for someone her age. The composition in question was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, specifically the first movement, a work so technically demanding that it had broken the spirits of conservatory students and professional musicians alike. The score sat propped on the music stand, covered in pencil markings and small notes written in a child's careful handwriting. Anya's teacher, Professor Dmitry Petrov, stood by the window watching with a mixture of pride and deep concern. He had taught piano for 42 years and had encountered perhaps a dozen truly exceptional students in that time. But Anya was something else entirely, something he had no proper framework to understand or guide. The story had begun 6 months earlier when Anya's parents, both engineers with no particular musical background, had brought their daughter to Professor Petrov's studio for an evaluation. They explained that Anya had taught herself to play piano using an old keyboard they had purchased at a yard sale, learning primarily from YouTube videos and whatever sheet music they could download for free. The parents seemed almost apologetic, worried they were wasting the professor's time with a child who probably had modest talent at best. They simply wanted professional guidance about whether formal lessons might be worthwhile. Professor Petrov had agreed to listen, expecting to hear the typical offerings of a self-taught beginner, perhaps some simple melodies executed with enthusiasm if not precision. He had planned to encourage the parents gently, suggest a younger teacher who specialized in beginners, and move on with his day. But when Anya sat at his studio piano and began to play, everything changed. She performed a Mozart sonata from memory, one that most students did not attempt until several years of training, and she played it not just correctly but with genuine musical understanding. Her small hands found solutions to technical challenges that should have been beyond her physical capabilities, and her interpretation showed sensitivity to phrasing and dynamics that typically developed only after long study. After the Mozart, Professor Petrov had asked her to play something else, anything she wanted. Anya had chosen a Chopin nocturne, then a Bach prelude, then a Debussy arabesque, moving through different styles and periods with ease. Each piece revealed the same impossible combination of technical facility and mature musicality. When she finished, the professor had sat in stunned silence for a long moment before asking the parents to leave the room. He needed to speak with Anya alone to understand what he was actually dealing with. In the private conversation that followed, Anya had explained her relationship with music in simple, direct terms that somehow made the inexplicable slightly more comprehensible. She did not experience playing piano as difficult or challenging in the way other people seemed to. When she looked at sheet music, she could simply see how it should sound and feel, and her hands found their way to making that happen. She practiced because she loved the music, not because she needed to drill techniques or memorize patterns. She listened to recordings constantly, absorbing performances by the great pianists of history, and somehow her 7-year-old brain processed and integrated these influences in ways that usually required decades of study. Professor Petrov had accepted Anya as a student that same day, though he worried privately about what taking on such a pupil might mean. Child prodigies were notoriously difficult to teach because their abilities often developed unevenly, leaving gaps in fundamental understanding even as they mastered advanced repertoire. There was also the psychological pressure, the risk of burnout, the danger of pushy parents or exploitative managers treating the child as a commodity rather than a person. But Anya's parents seemed genuinely caring and protective, more concerned about their daughter's happiness than any potential fame or fortune. And Anya herself displayed a love of music so pure and joyful that refusing to nurture it felt almost criminal. For the first several months, Professor Petrov had focused on filling in the gaps in Anya's foundation, teaching her music theory and proper technique, ensuring she understood the principles underlying her intuitive abilities. Anya absorbed everything with frightening speed, treating each lesson as a fascinating puzzle to solve rather than tedious work to endure. She practiced 4 to 5 hours daily, not because anyone forced her, but because she genuinely preferred playing piano to any other activity. Her parents had established rules about schoolwork and outdoor time, insisting she maintain a normal childhood alongside her musical development. And Anya complied without complaint, though she clearly counted the minutes until she could return to the keyboard. Then one day in early March, Anya had arrived at her lesson carrying a worn recording of the Rachmaninoff Third Piano Concerto. She had discovered it while exploring classical music online, had listened to it perhaps 50 times in the past week, and had decided she wanted to learn it. Professor Petrov had immediately tried to redirect her toward more age-appropriate repertoire, explaining that the Rachmaninoff Third was considered one of the most difficult pieces in the entire piano literature, that it required not just technical skill but physical size and strength that she simply did not possess, that even attempting it might damage her developing hands and wrists. But Anya had looked at him with those serious dark eyes and said something that haunted him still. She said that the music was already complete inside her head, that she could hear exactly how every note should sound, and that she just needed to figure out how to transfer what she heard onto the actual piano. She understood it was difficult, she said, but difficulty was not the same as impossible, and she wanted to try. She promised to stop immediately if it hurt or if her other playing suffered, but she asked him please to at least let her begin working on it. Against his better judgment, Professor Petrov had agreed, setting strict conditions about practice time and technique. He told himself he would let her explore the piece for a week or two, satisfy her curiosity, and then guide her back to more sensible repertoire. But a week had passed, then 2, then 4, and Anya continued working on the Rachmaninoff with unwavering focus. She broke it into small sections, studying each one separately, finding creative solutions to passages that seemed physically impossible for her small hands. She listened to recordings by Horowitz, by Argerich, by Kissin, absorbing different interpretations and forging her own understanding. Now, 6 weeks into the project, she was attempting to play through the entire first movement, and Professor Petrov stood watching with emotions he could not fully articulate. Part of him remained convinced this was madness, that he was failing in his duty as a teacher by allowing a 7-year-old to attempt repertoire designed for mature concert artists. But another part of him recognized that he was witnessing something genuinely extraordinary, something that happened perhaps once in a generation, and that his job was not to limit Anya, but to protect and guide her as she explored the full reach of her remarkable gifts. Anya's fingers moved across the keyboard with a precision that seemed to contradict every law of childhood development. The opening measures of the Rachmaninoff Concerto flowed from the piano, not perfectly but recognizably, the famous cascading runs emerging from hands that should have been playing simple children's pieces. Professor Petrov listened intently, tracking both the musical execution and any signs of physical strain. He watched her wrists for tension, her shoulders for hunching, her face for grimaces of pain. So far she seemed relaxed, almost serene, as if the impossible task before her was simply another interesting problem to solve. The passage that had stumped her for the past week approached, a section where the composer demanded enormous stretches between notes that required adult-sized hands. Anya had tried various solutions, adjusting her hand position, using the pedal to sustain certain notes while her hands jumped to others, even slightly altering the voicing to make the music playable without losing its essential character. Professor Petrov had shown her historical recordings where famous pianists had made similar adjustments, explaining that interpretation sometimes meant finding creative solutions rather than slavish adherence to what was written on the page. Anya had absorbed this lesson eagerly, treating it as permission to think rather than just permission to cheat. As she reached the problem passage now, her hands executed the solution she had developed, a clever redistribution of notes between left and right hand that preserved the musical line while accommodating her physical limitations. It was not perfect, not exactly what Rachmaninoff had written, but it was musical and coherent and impressively thought out for someone who had been alive for less than 3,000 days. Professor Petrov found himself nodding unconsciously, making mental notes about what to address in the post-practice discussion. The movement continued, Anya navigating through technically demanding sections with varying degrees of success. Some passages emerged clearly and beautifully, revealing her natural musicality and quick learning ability. Others remained rough, notes fumbled, or rhythms uncertain, showing that even extraordinary talent required time and repetition to master difficult material. But what struck Professor Petrov most forcefully was her emotional engagement with the music. She was not simply executing notes on a page. She was telling a story, shaping phrases with intention, building tension and releasing it, making musical choices that demonstrated genuine artistic understanding. When she finally reached the end of the movement, her hands lifted from the keys and she sat quietly for a moment before turning to look at her teacher. Her expression sought evaluation and guidance, the normal response of a dedicated student, but Professor Petrov also saw something else there, a quiet confidence that she was on the right track, that what she was attempting was not foolish but worthwhile. He walked over to the piano and sat beside her on the bench, something he rarely did with students, preferring to maintain professional distance. But with Anya, normal pedagogical rules often seemed inadequate. "That was remarkable progress," he said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "The section we worked on last week is much clearer now, and your solution to the stretch problem in measure 73 is quite intelligent. But I want to talk about something beyond the technical execution." He paused, making sure he had her full attention. "Do you understand why this piece is considered so difficult, not just in terms of the notes, but in terms of what it demands emotionally and intellectually?" Anya considered the question seriously, her face taking on the thoughtful expression that always appeared when she engaged with musical concepts. "It needs someone who has lived more life than me," she said finally, her grammar slightly awkward but her meaning perfectly clear. "The music is about big feelings, adult feelings, and I can hear what those should sound like. But I do not know if I can really make them happen because I have not felt them myself." Professor Petrov felt a chill run down his spine. This kind of self-awareness was rare in adult musicians, let alone children. "That is exactly right," he said quietly. "And this is why I have been so hesitant about this project. You have the technical ability, or at least you are developing it remarkably quickly. But music at this level requires life experience to fully inhabit, and that is something no amount of talent or practice can substitute for." "I know," Anya replied, swinging her legs slightly as they dangled from the bench. "But I still want to learn it. Maybe I cannot play it the way a grown-up would, but I can play it the way I understand it now, and then when I am older, I can understand it differently and play it differently. The music teacher at school says that we grow into books as we get older, that stories mean new things when we read them again. Maybe music is like that too." The professor smiled despite his concerns. "Your school teacher is wise and so are you. Yes, music absolutely works that way. The pieces we learn young stay with us and reveal new dimensions as we mature." He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "But I need you to promise me something. If this ever stops being joyful, if it becomes a burden or a source of stress, you must tell me immediately. And if your hands hurt, even a little bit, we stop working on this piece. Your long-term health is more important than any single composition, no matter how beautiful." Anya nodded solemnly, treating the promise with appropriate seriousness. "I promise, it does not hurt and I love working on it. It makes me feel like I am having a conversation with Rachmaninoff, like he is teaching me something even though he died a long time ago." They spent the next 30 minutes working on specific sections, Professor Petrov offering suggestions about fingering and pedaling, Anya trying different approaches and discussing what worked and what did not. Their collaboration had developed into something unusual, less like traditional teacher and student and more like two musicians exploring a score together, each bringing different strengths to the interpretation. The professor contributed his decades of knowledge and experience, while Anya brought fresh ears and an intuitive musicality that often led to surprising insights. As the lesson concluded, Anya's mother arrived to collect her, knocking softly before entering the practice room. Marina Volkov was a software engineer who approached her daughter's musical gift with a mixture of pride and worry. She had been reading everything she could find about child prodigies, and the stories were not always encouraging. For every success story, there seemed to be tales of burned-out teenagers, of overbearing parents who destroyed their children's love of music, of young talents who peaked early and spent the rest of their lives in bitterness. Marina was determined that Anya's childhood would not be sacrificed on the altar of exceptional ability. "How did it go today?" Marina asked, looking between her daughter and the professor. "She is making excellent progress," Professor Petrov replied, standing and gathering his notes. "But I would like to speak with you privately for a few minutes if you have time. Anya, why don't you go practice your scales in the small room down the hall? Just 15 minutes, nothing from the Rachmaninoff right now." Anya nodded and skipped out of the room, her energy level remarkably high for someone who had just completed an intensive practice session. Once she was gone, Professor Petrov turned to Marina with a serious expression. "I need to be honest with you about what is happening here. Your daughter is not simply talented. She is operating at a level I have encountered perhaps once before in my entire career. The piece she is working on should be impossible for a 7-year-old, and yet she is actually making progress on it." Marina's face showed the conflict she felt. Is this healthy? Should we be encouraging this, or should we be pulling back, making sure she has a normal childhood? "Those are exactly the right questions," the professor said. "And I do not have perfect answers. What I can tell you is that Anya's love of music appears genuine and self-directed. She is not performing for approval or trying to please adults. She truly loves the work itself. That is a good sign, a healthy sign." but we must watch carefully for any changes in that dynamic. He walked to the window, looking out over the conservatory grounds where students hurried between buildings in the late afternoon light. There is something else you should know. Word is beginning to spread about Anya. Other faculty members have heard her practice and they are talking. There will be pressure probably soon to have her perform publicly to enter competitions to accelerate her development. I want your permission to refuse all such requests for at least another year, possibly two. She needs time to develop without the pressure of public scrutiny. Marina felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. What kind of pressure are we talking about? Conservatory recitals, possibly media interest, competition organizers who will argue that she should be tested against other young talents. And if anyone outside this building learns about the Rachmaninoff project, the pressure will intensify considerably. He turned back to face her directly. I have seen what happens when prodigies are pushed into the spotlight too early. Some thrive, but many do not. The attention becomes toxic, the expectations become crushing, and the joy that made them special in the first place gets destroyed. Then we protect her from that, Marina said firmly. For as long as possible, we keep this private and let her just be a child who loves music. Professor Petrov nodded with relief. I am very glad to hear you say that. There is one more thing, though. I think Anya would benefit from performing, just not publicly yet. I would like to arrange for her to play for small groups of trusted colleagues, perhaps some of the other faculty members, to help her get comfortable sharing her music without the pressure of formal concerts. Would you be comfortable with that? Marina considered this carefully. As long as it remains low pressure and supportive, yes. I trust your judgment on this, Professor. You have been wonderful with her, and I know you have her best interests at heart. They talked for a few more minutes about practice schedules and upcoming holidays, and then Marina collected Anya from the practice room. As they left the conservatory building and walked toward their car, Marina asked her daughter the question she asked after every lesson. Are you happy, sweetheart? Is this still fun for you? Anya looked up at her mother with a smile that seemed to contain sunshine. I am very happy, Mama. Today I figured out how to make measure 85 work, and it sounds almost like the recording now. Professor Petrov says that next week we will start on the second theme, which is my favorite part. Marina felt some of her anxiety ease. As long as her daughter maintained this enthusiasm, as long as music remained a source of joy rather than stress, they were probably on the right path. But she would remain vigilant, watching for any signs that the extraordinary gift her daughter possessed was becoming a burden rather than a blessing. 3 months after that conversation, Anya stood backstage in a small recital hall within the conservatory, waiting to perform for an audience of approximately 30 people. These were not strangers or critics or competition judges, but rather a carefully selected group of music faculty, advanced students, and a few trusted colleagues of Professor Petrov who had been invited to witness what he had described only as a remarkable young talent. None of them knew specifically what they were about to hear, and Professor Petrov had been deliberately vague about the program, wanting the music to speak for itself without the distortion of advance expectations. Anya wore a simple black dress that her mother had purchased for the occasion, her hair neatly braided, her hands fidgeting slightly with nervous energy. This was not her first time playing for others. She had performed informally for family and friends many times, but it was her first time playing in a proper recital setting with an audience of musicians who would understand exactly what they were hearing. Professor Petrov stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her small frame. Remember what we talked about, he said quietly. You are not here to prove anything to anyone. You are here to share music that you love with people who will appreciate it. Some of them may be surprised by what you play, but that is fine. Surprise can be a good thing. Anya nodded, taking a deep breath the way her teacher had shown her, breathing in for 4 counts and out for 6, using the technique to calm her racing heart. I am ready, she said, though her voice carried a slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. They had debated the program extensively over the past weeks. Professor Petrov had initially suggested a conservative selection, perhaps some Mozart and Chopin, pieces that would showcase Anya's abilities without shocking the audience. But Anya had argued, politely but persistently, that she wanted to play the Rachmaninoff. She had been working on it for nearly 4 months now, had memorized the entire first movement, and felt ready to share it. The professor had resisted, worried that the reaction might be overwhelming, that colleagues might judge him harshly for allowing such an ambitious undertaking, that the performance might not go well and damage Anya's confidence. But eventually he had relented, agreeing to let her perform the Rachmaninoff first movement with one condition. She would also play 2 shorter pieces first, a Mozart sonata and a Chopin waltz, giving the audience a chance to appreciate her musicality in more conventional repertoire before hitting them with the impossible. Anya had agreed to this compromise, understanding the strategic wisdom even if she found it slightly annoying. Now, as the stage manager signaled that they were ready to begin, Professor Petrov walked out first to offer a brief introduction. He kept it simple, explaining only that they were about to hear a young student who had been working with him for several months, that the program would include pieces by Mozart, Chopin, and Rachmaninoff, and that he asked the audience to hold their questions and reactions until after the performance concluded. He deliberately did not mention Anya's age, wanting that revelation to come naturally when she walked onto the stage. When Anya emerged from the wings and approached the piano, a visible ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Several people exchanged glances, clearly not having expected such a young performer. The piano bench had been adjusted to its lowest setting, and a special footrest had been positioned to give her access to the pedals, accommodations that further emphasized her small size. She bowed slightly to the audience, the way Professor Petrov had taught her, and then climbed onto the bench, adjusting her position with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone focused entirely on the task at hand. The Mozart sonata began cleanly, Anya's fingers moving through the familiar passages with confidence. The piece was well within her abilities, and she played it beautifully, demonstrating both technical control and musical sensitivity. The audience listened attentively, and by the end of the first movement, the initial surprise at her age had given way to appreciation of her genuine talent. This was clearly an exceptional young student, the kind that conservatories hope to identify and nurture, but not yet something that defied categorization. The Chopin waltz followed, and here Anya's interpretation showed more personality, more willingness to shape phrases according to her own musical instincts. She took slight liberties with tempo, adding rubato in ways that felt organic rather than mannered, and her touch on the keys produced a singing tone that many adult pianists struggled to achieve. The audience warmed further, several people nodding in appreciation, and when the waltz concluded, there was enthusiastic applause that made Anya smile shyly before turning back to the keyboard. Then came the moment Professor Petrov had been simultaneously anticipating and dreading. Anya paused longer this time, taking several deep breaths, her hands resting in her lap as she prepared herself mentally for the challenge ahead. The audience settled into expectant silence, assuming perhaps that another short romantic piece would follow. When Anya's hands finally rose to the keyboard and the opening chords of the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto rang out, the reaction was immediate and visible. People sat forward in their seats, several faculty members' eyes widening in recognition and disbelief. This was not possible. Their expressions seemed to say, no 7-year-old attempts this repertoire, and yet the music continued, Anya's small hands navigating the treacherous opening passage with remarkable accuracy. She had memorized not just the solo piano part, but had also internalized the orchestral portions, so the performance had a complete quality despite the absence of the actual orchestra. Her intense concentration was visible in every line of her body, and the audience found themselves holding their breath, unsure whether to hope she would succeed or fear she would fail spectacularly. The first major technical challenge arrived, a passage of rapid octaves that required strength and span that seemed impossible for her hand size. Anya had developed a modified fingering that used quick position shifts instead of true octaves, a solution that preserved the musical effect while acknowledging her physical limitations. Some purists in the audience might have objected to the alteration, but the musical line remained intact, and the sheer audacity of the attempt overrode any concerns about strict accuracy. As the movement progressed, something remarkable happened in the room. The initial shock began to transform into something else, a kind of collective awe at witnessing someone so young engage so completely with music of such depth and difficulty. Yes, there were mistakes, moments where her fingers fumbled or her memory faltered slightly, but there was also undeniable musicality, genuine understanding of the architecture and emotion of the piece. She was not simply executing notes she had memorized, she was performing music she understood and loved. The famous lyrical second theme emerged with touching sensitivity, Anya's natural gift for singing tone serving the melody beautifully. Here, freed from the most extreme technical demands, her youth became almost an advantage, bringing a quality of innocent yearning to the music that more experienced players might have overthought. Professor Petrov, watching from the side of the stage, felt tears gathering in his eyes despite his efforts to maintain professional composure. The final section of the movement approached, building toward the dramatic conclusion with its thunderous chords and cascading runs. Anya threw herself into it with abandon, her whole body engaged in producing the required sound, her small frame generating surprising power from the instrument. A string broke somewhere in the final measures, the metallic snap audible throughout the hall, but Anya did not falter, continuing through to the final triumphant chords as if nothing had happened. When her hands finally lifted from the keyboard and the last resonance faded into silence, the hall remained absolutely quiet for several long seconds. Anya sat very still, unsure whether the silence meant success or failure, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Then someone in the third row, a composition professor named Dr. Helena Sokolov, stood and began to applaud. Immediately everyone else followed, the applause building into something almost overwhelming, people rising to their feet and clapping with an intensity that made Anya's eyes go wide with surprise and relief. She stood and bowed, remembering her training, but her child's composure cracked slightly, and she smiled with such pure joy that it made several audience members laugh with affection. Professor Petrov walked onto the stage and placed his arm around her shoulders, and the applause continued, people refusing to stop, some wiping their eyes, all of them recognizing that they had witnessed something genuinely extraordinary. When the applause finally subsided and people began to gather their belongings, the atmosphere in the hall was electric with excited conversation. Faculty members clustered in small groups, discussing what they had just seen, debating its implications, and universally expressing amazement. Several approached Professor Petrov immediately, asking questions about Anya's background and training, wondering if she might perform for larger audiences, suggesting contacts at music festivals and competition organizations. Professor Petrov fielded the questions diplomatically, thanking colleagues for their enthusiasm while firmly declining all suggestions for public performances or competitions. He had anticipated this reaction and had prepared his responses carefully, emphasizing Anya's need for continued development in a protected environment, the importance of preserving her childhood, and the dangers of premature exposure to professional pressures. Some colleagues understood immediately and nodded their support, while others looked disappointed but respectful of his judgment. A few, however, seemed almost offended by his caution, arguing that talent of this magnitude had obligations to the musical world that transcended individual comfort or preference. Dr. Sokolov, the composition professor who had been first to stand, approached with a thoughtful expression. She was a woman in her 60s who had devoted her life to music and had witnessed many promising young talents over the decades. "Dmitri," she said quietly, drawing him slightly away from the other conversations, "I understand your protective instincts and they do you credit. But I must tell you something honestly. What we just witnessed is not simply exceptional talent. That child has a gift that appears perhaps once in a generation, maybe less frequently. The question is not whether she will face pressure and scrutiny, but when and under what circumstances." Professor Petrov felt the weight of her words but held his ground. "Which is precisely why we must be strategic and careful. Rushing her into the spotlight now could destroy the very thing that makes her special. She needs time to develop not just as a musician but as a person." "I agree completely," Dr. Sokolov replied, surprising him. "I am not suggesting we parade her before the media tomorrow. But I do think you should begin planning for what comes next, because what comes next is inevitable. Word will spread beyond this room, it already is spreading, and you will lose control of the narrative if you do not shape it proactively." Their conversation was interrupted by Anya herself, who had been patiently receiving compliments from audience members but now sought refuge with her teacher. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline of performance giving way to the fatigue that always followed intense concentration. "Can we go home now?" she asked simply, leaning against Professor Petrov's side. "Of course," he said, placing his hand on her head affectionately. "You were magnificent today. We will talk more about it tomorrow, but for now you should rest." Marina appeared from the back of the hall where she had been watching, her face showing the complex emotions of a parent who had just seen her child do something remarkable and slightly terrifying. She thanked Professor Petrov and guided Anya toward the exit, navigating through well-wishers who wanted to offer one more compliment or ask one more question. As they finally escaped to the parking lot, Marina knelt down to her daughter's eye level. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" she asked, searching Anya's face for any signs of distress or overwhelm. "Tired," Anya admitted, "but happy. I made some mistakes, but I think the music still worked. Did you like it, Mama?" Marina pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, feeling tears she had been holding back finally escape. "I loved it and I am so proud of you, not because you played something difficult but because you shared something beautiful." The drive home was quiet, Anya dozing in the back seat while Marina's mind raced with thoughts about the future. She had seen the reactions of the faculty members, had overheard fragments of conversations about recordings and concert tour and international competitions. Part of her felt fierce pride that her daughter could generate such excitement and recognition. But a larger part felt afraid, protective, desperate to shield Anya from becoming a spectacle or a commodity. That evening, after Anya had eaten dinner and gone to bed early, Marina sat with her husband Alexei and discussed what should happen next. Alexei had not been able to attend the recital due to a work commitment, but Marina described everything in detail, including the conversations afterward and Dr. Sokolov's warning about losing control of the narrative. Maybe we should pull back entirely, Alexei suggested, his engineer's mind seeking the safest solution. No more public playing, even small recitals like today. Just private lessons and practice until she is older and better able to handle pressure. Marina shook her head slowly. I do not think that is realistic or even healthy. Music is not just what Anya does, it is who she is. Asking her to hide that completely would be like asking her to hide part of herself. Besides, she needs to perform. Professor Petrov says that learning to share music with others is essential to development as an artist. They talked late into the night, exploring options and scenarios, trying to chart a course between exploitation and suppression, between nurturing their daughter's gift and protecting her childhood. Eventually, they agreed on several principles that would guide their decisions going forward. Anya's happiness and well-being would always take precedence over musical achievement. She would continue normal school alongside her musical training, maintaining friendships and activities unrelated to piano. Any performance opportunities would be carefully vetted and limited in frequency, and they would resist all pressure to treat her as a professional musician rather than a child who happened to have exceptional musical abilities. Over the following weeks, these principles were tested repeatedly. A music journalist somehow learned about the recital and contacted Professor Petrov, requesting an interview with Anya. A television producer wanted to feature her on a program about child prodigies. Competition organizers offered guaranteed prizes if she would simply enter their events. A recording company executive expressed interest in producing an album. Each request was politely but firmly declined, with Professor Petrov serving as a protective barrier between Anya and the growing external interest. But within the conservatory walls, Anya's education continued steadily. She had finished memorizing all three movements of the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto and was now working on other repertoire, expanding her knowledge of different composers and styles. Professor Petrov introduced her to the music of Scriabin and Prokofiev, of Schubert and Schumann, watching as she absorbed each new stylistic world with the same intuitive understanding she had shown with Rachmaninoff. 6 months after the small recital, Professor Petrov proposed a new idea to Anya's parents. The Moscow Youth Orchestra was planning their annual concert, and the conductor, an old friend, had expressed interest in featuring Anya as a soloist. It would be a semi-public performance, ticketed but not heavily advertised, with an audience of primarily students and their families. The repertoire would be Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23, technically challenging but more age-appropriate than the Rachmaninoff, and the performance would give Anya her first experience playing with orchestra. After much discussion, Marina and Alexei agreed with strict conditions. There would be no media coverage, no recordings distributed beyond the family, and no announcements in advance that might generate unwanted attention. If Anya showed any signs of stress or unhappiness during rehearsals, they would withdraw immediately. The rehearsals began in January, and Anya approached them with her characteristic combination of seriousness and joy. Working with the orchestra presented new challenges. Learning to listen while playing, to coordinate with the conductor's tempo, to balance her sound against the larger ensemble. But she adapted quickly, and the young orchestra members were charmed by her presence, this tiny person among them who played with such authority and musicality. The conductor, Maestro Victor Orlov, had worked with soloists for 30 years and prided himself on his ability to judge musical potential. After the first full rehearsal with Anya, he pulled Professor Petrov aside and spoke bluntly. "You know what you have there, yes. That child is not just talented, she has something else, something I cannot name but I recognize when I see it. She has the quality that separates good musicians from great ones." Professor Petrov nodded wearily. "I know, believe me, I know. The question is how to nurture it without destroying it." "There may not be a way," Maestro Orlov said honestly. "The pressures will come regardless of what you do. But if you can give her even a few more years of protected development, years where music remains joyful rather than obligatory, you will have given her a foundation that can sustain her through whatever comes later." The concert took place on a cold February evening, almost exactly 1 year after Anya had first begun working on the Rachmaninoff. The hall was perhaps 2/3 full, a respectable audience for a youth orchestra concert, but nothing like the crowds that would eventually come to hear her. Anya wore a white dress and looked impossibly small walking onto the stage beside Maestro Orlov. But when she sat at the piano and the orchestra began the opening bars of the Mozart concerto, all thoughts of her age fell away. The performance was not perfect. The orchestra struggled in a few places, and Anya rushed slightly in the final movement's cadenza, her excitement getting the better of her tempo control. But the essential musicality was there, the communication between soloist and ensemble, the joy of collaborative music making. When the final chord sounded and the audience applauded warmly, Anya beamed with happiness, bowing to the orchestra members before bowing to the audience, observing the protocols she had been taught. In the audience, Marina sat with tears streaming down her face, holding Alexei's hand tightly. They both understood that this moment represented a threshold crossed, that their daughter was moving inexorably toward a future they could not fully control or predict. But they also saw the pure happiness on Anya's face, the way she glowed with satisfaction at having shared music she loved with people who appreciated it. And they knew they had made the right choice in allowing her to develop her gift rather than suppressing it out of fear. After the concert, as they drove home through snowy streets, Anya chattered excitedly about the experience, about how different it felt to play with orchestra compared to solo, about the mistakes she had made and how she would fix them next time, about how Maestro Orlov had smiled at her during the second movement. Her parents listened and encouraged, asking questions and celebrating her achievement, while privately wondering what the next year would bring. That night, after Anya had finally fallen asleep still buzzing with excitement, Marina checked her email and found a message from Professor Petrov. It contained a single paragraph informing them that despite their efforts at discretion, someone had recorded the concert on their phone and posted a video to social media. In the 18 hours since the performance, it had been viewed over 200,000 times and was spreading rapidly. The protective bubble they had tried to maintain was about to burst, and ready or not, the world was going to discover Anya Volkov. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.